All right. So you guys can see the calendar up on my screen. I showed this one during the last conference call, and again, this isn't like you have to follow this. This isn't the exact due dates for everything, but this is just keeping you posted and keeping you going, things to focus on each day and things you should have done by the end of the week. All right, so if you haven't yet done project setup or you're still working on your LDD, got to get those things submitted so you can get some feedback and start working on the next batch of assignments. So yes, the assignments are all due at the end, but they all build on each other, right? So I just want to give everyone a schedule to make sure you're not going to get real overwhelmed when we get down to week 3 and 4 and you're trying to still, play catch up from the earlier weeks. All right, so today I'm just going to kind of highlight some things about the control station to look out for, as well as I want to talk about the bubble diagram and the purpose of doing that. All right, so you can see for this week it says control station. That's the first thing or one of the things early on you want to knock out. Try to make sure you get those technical things done during the week. That way if you're having any trouble, you can reach out to myself or Anthony in Discord or FSO and we can help you out with those problems, and then you can finish up your bubble diagram. Even if that takes you into the weekend, that's okay. All right, so you can see for today it says bubble diagram research. Anytime where it says research, that's just preparing and understanding what you need to do for the assignment. So inside the bubble diagram, under the directions, the research part is the playlist. All right, so the research is going to be the resources in here, the things you want to check out before you actually do the activity. So if you've never even used Google Draw, I'm sure some of you have by this point. We have a video in here that'll just teach you the basics of Google Draw, how to actually use the tool, ways to actually navigate this tool if you've never used it before. All right, down below there's these two articles, and I think these are very, very fantastic and a great thing to utilize as a level designer. So let me go ahead and load these. All right, so this first article is about an architect's perspective on level design. This was about a student that went through and graduated from an architecture degree and realized that he didn't want to be in architecture. So he got a job at LucasArts working on Star Wars Bounty Hunter. If any of you ever played that, you might have in the past. He did level design for this, and through this article, he starts to explain his process as well as the correlations he made, and starting to realize, man, there's a lot of things that go into level design that relate to architecture. There's a lot of parallels between the two. So what this article is explaining is his overall workflow. All right, so you see he breaks it down into major sections. Research before you design, right? So coming up and understanding what is the game I'm trying to make, what is expected of me, what is the actual design I'm trying to create, right? Then you can see he brainstorms his ideas and creates a level design document, right? And then getting into doing some sketches and concepts, and then we get into the bubble diagram. All right, so this is actually starting to lay out the level and lay out the spaces of the level without worrying about the physical space. All right, so after the bubble diagram starts to iterate, and here you can see him starting to sketch the map over the top of it, and then converting that bubble diagram into the map. So this process that you're going to read about is actually something that you're in the middle of doing right now. You've already done some, or hopefully you've already done some research on your design, right? Understanding what is scraps all about. What am I allowed to do in this space? Then you came up with possible ideas for your level and formulated them into the document. Now you're at the point you're going to start to brainstorm or you start to build your bubble diagram, the actual layout of the level itself. So this other article is very similar, but this is a very, very simple and structured way to see this process. All right, so this 5-step process you see here is really something I've modeled the design tasks around in this course. Right, so really building up this structure so that way you'll start to realize whether you're making a game for Scraps or Star Wars Bounty Hunter or Angry Birds or any other potential title that you get hired to work on, you can have this process, you can have this structure to go through to then build your design. Right, so again, understanding your constraints, what that's all about, brainstorming and structure, actually building out those ideas and coming up with the plan of attack, The bubble diagram actually making a very simple version of the map, right? In circles indicating areas in the level and arrows indicating the flow. That's really what your bubble diagram is bubbles and arrows representing the flow of the level itself. And then getting into actually building the maps, right, and laying that on top. So two different articles talking about a similar process. So you can see this isn't just a process that I came up with, but something that you guys can utilize and something that's out there in the industry that people follow. All right, so let me go back to the bubble diagram assignment. All right, so this video playlist, you can go ahead and check this out. This will break down everything in what I'm looking for. I can go over, and there are a few things I do want to highlight, so I can go through these slides, but definitely remember about these playlists and check them out before you actually build the bubble diagram or start to work on your assignment. All right, so let me just jump over, and I'm just going to talk about the concept overall with the bubble diagram. All right, so the purpose of doing this assignment is really to focus on how the player progresses through each setup, right? So in the level design document, you answered the question of what is the player doing? What is the goal? What is the major task? What's the problem in the level to fix? What are the mechanics you're going to use? Really, what does the player do, right? The bubble diagram, now you start to organize those setups and figure out how the player gets through each space and gets to the next area. All right, so the layout of this physical space is what you want to really think about, right? You're actually laying out the space from a top-down perspective. But at this point, you don't want to worry about visuals. You don't want to worry about the aesthetics of the level just yet. We want to figure out the flow. All right, so make any adjustments to your design before you start. So if you notice something after reviewing your peers' feedback that maybe your mechanics aren't working or you want to add more detail to your featured asset, if you want to contact me and get more detailed one-on-one feedback, I'd be more than happy to do that with anybody. So feel free to reach out and we can meet up. We can talk through Discord or just chat and figure out anything you want to change before you go to the next step. All right, so coming up with a few different variations. Rather than, I'm not asking you to do the assignment 3 or 4 times, but come up with a few different layouts of your level. Come out with a few different structures of how things could be addressed, and then choose the best one to then add the notes and the note numbers and all of the other smaller details. All right, and then lastly, don't worry about what your bubble diagram looks like. It's not supposed to be pretty. It's not supposed to be visually flashy. That's what we're going to get to with the map. Think of the bubble diagram as the skeleton to your map itself. So here's just a simple layout version of the bubble diagram, and what is it for? Why are we taking the time to do this? And just showing you some examples. So on the left, you see an example of a bubble diagram, someone using it for their house. You can see here they got the backyard, they have the spot where their shed, a compost area, right? All these smaller pieces, but it's the exact size, the exact position, and things aren't yet solidified. So using the bubble diagram, we can then create an actual final plan, right? This would be the equivalent of your map that you're going to make. So here you can see, notice the size of the lawn in the back and how big it is compared to everything else. So that's just one general thing that they knew, is they knew they wanted the lawn to take up the most of the space. It's not like the patio is taking up the majority of the space in the back. So that's one thing you want to think about for your bubble diagram, is the overall proportion of each bubble and the overall size of the areas that you're designing. Right? So you can see when you go to the map, things can change. So this study A has a lot of hard angles, a lot of 90-degree edges everywhere, a lot of straight lines. And study B has a lot more organic curves and shapes. Both of these can be generated from this bubble diagram, right? So you can use this as a starting point and then polish and make it exactly how you want it to look in the end. So bubble diagrams are used a lot in architecture, and here's a real-world example of that with the Tulsa Zoo. So here you can see different bubbles or different plans for the areas of the zoo, right? So down here you've got Africa, and you've got Asia up here, you've got North America, et cetera, et cetera. They're all just blobs, all just vague bubbles for what they're going to represent later on. As the plans develop, this is where you can see you have a layer of the bubbles as well as you starting to see the structures underneath. You see the buildings, you see the walkways. You're starting to see some of the details of what it will look like, but you still have those bubbles laid on top. So now when we pull the bubbles away and we add in the color for the areas, now you can see this is starting to be a finalized plan for what it is that is going to be constructed. This is the architect's blueprint for then building everything in each environment, in each area, right? So this would be your map. That's what you're going to end up with. So here you can see each step side by side. Where on the left, these are the vague bubbles. This is where, the in-between, where you can still see the bubbles, but you see some of the detail down below. And then here they take the bubbles away, and this is the final plan. This almost looks like, the pamphlet that you get when you go to the zoo and actually start to see the detail, right? The red is the user's experience walking through this park. The yellow is, the area, actual environments, and then, they've got the gray walls and things like that, and really showing all of the details. So at first, all those small details don't matter until we have an actual plan of how things should be laid out. So if you're working on this and your boss came to you and said, actually, we're going to take Africa and we're going to switch it out with North America. If you're at the bubble diagram phase of that, you're like, okay, no problem. Just move this one bubble and switch it out with the other one, right? But if you've gone to this extent and you've got all this little detail, and then your boss says, yeah, we're actually going to completely change this and move this around, and this isn't going to be here anymore, now you have a lot more work to fix, right? A lot more work to redo. So by building the bubble diagram, it allows you to actually see your level and visualize the plan before you put in all this work to finalize the map. All right? So how you should start building the bubble diagram is first by just creating these bubbles, right? So really think of each bubble in your map as just a space. Think of each bubble as an area in the level that something happens. Here in my example here it says generator room, but don't even, I don't want you to think that a bubble is a room. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. If you're building a level outside, like in a junkyard or something in an underground bunker, it doesn't necessarily need to be a physical room with 4 walls. Think of a bubble as an area in your level that the player needs to complete certain interactions or certain setups in order to progress to the next area. What the generator room looks like doesn't really matter. It could be a circular room, it could be a square room, it could be an octagon, it could have several floors. The layout of the room still doesn't yet matter until we know what does the player do in the generator room. So answer these questions as you're starting to build your bubbles, right? So what purpose does the space serve? If the player is just walking through the environment, remove it, right? We don't want to have big empty spaces that look cool. We want there to be interactions. So focus on quality and focus on making each space that you're designing have some purpose. Right? So label out any actions. Think about your mechanics. Remember, the introduced practice and mastery of your mechanics is the core of your level. Right? So figure out where they're going to be introducing, where you're going to be practicing those mechanics, and lay all of that out. All right? Also, remember your level should take about 4 minutes on average to complete. Minimum of 2, maximum of 4 minutes. So give an estimate for how long you're expecting the player to take in each bubble, in each space. If that estimate is over 4 minutes, then you might be pushing things over the extended amount of time. So these estimates will become more exact as we go forward, but do a rough estimate right now. How long are you expecting the player to take in that space? And then lastly, you'll see in the background a reference image. So this is how we're going to communicate what each area looks like at this phase of the level, or at this phase of the process. So find some reference images. I encourage you to find as many as you can, but at least one reference image per bubble. The more reference images you have, the easier it's going to be to build your level and construct these pieces. So an image like this, we really want to start to, the reason why we're doing this is because you can start to identify the modularity. Right? Notice how this big generator turbine object is basically the same as the one in the foreground as well as the background. So we can build this one modular piece, or even break it down to say, here we'll build a railing, make that into a prefab. We'll build this front turbine part and build that out, right? And then we can build modular pieces and then reconstruct them in Unity, right, or in our game engine. Even smaller details like paying attention to the windows and noticing, the window frame, the distances between the windows, how high the windows are up from the wall, the ceiling, or the floor, right? All of those little details will start to help you build your level when you get to that point. So try to gather as much as you can right now. Gather a bunch of images, and you can always filter them out or mix and match to get some practice actually creating that. And that's one thing we're going to do in the control station this week, is analyze some reference images and recreate those references as best as we can, focusing on the major shapes. All right, so you'll also see on your bubbles, I want you to include note numbers, right? So the notes are really the important piece of information. You should be able to read through the notes from start to finish and get a good sense of the player's experience through the level, right? So include at least one note number in each bubble explaining what happens. So in the generator room, once they arrive, they get a verbal cue saying that they need to find the new fuse for the generator. And then here in note 16, they pick up the fuse with the grab-null, attach it to the generator. This now powers on the crane, and they can go forward and interact with the crane. All right? So really try to plan out what happens in each bubble and in each space. And then you'll start to connect your bubbles using transitions. All right? So interactive transitions. I'm sure as you guys have played games all your life, you've seen these, just may not have noticed what's actually happening. So we have two-way transitions and one-way transitions. So a two-way transition, obviously you can go back and forth between it, one space to the next. And now a one-way transition, once the player progresses, they're no longer able to go back to the previous area. So anyone here that's joining me live, if you guys want to either raise your hand or turn on your mics, does anybody have an example of a one-way transition or a two-way transition that may be something you've experienced in a game or something that comes to mind? Anybody have an example of something that you might have experienced that's a one-way or two-way transition? You can also type your answer into chat if you don't have a microphone. All right, so Michael said, would a two-way transition be like in Fallout, leaving a building or going into one? Yeah, if it's just a door that you interact with or an opening that you're allowed to walk into the building and then leave, then yeah, that's an example of a two-way transition, able to actually go through. Would a fast travel system be an example of a two-way transition? Yes, that is a high-level version of it, where you can have, you jump between areas in the map. In like an open world game, you're able to jump between major positions, and yeah, that would be a two-way transition. Things like in Diablo, if anyone's played Diablo, I'm sure I got some few fans watching. When you go between acts, right, in Diablo, and that big prompt says, "Are you sure you'd like to go forward?" Once you go to the next act, you're not allowed to come back, right? That's an example of a one-way transition. And those are high level, right? That's like on a game, like the actual game systems. So things for in a specific level, right? One of the most cliche things you probably experience in an actual level is you walk into a building and the door shuts behind you, right? Or a cave-in happens, so the player, the ceiling just magically collapses right when the player walks through. Things like that to prevent the player from going backwards, right? I also challenge everybody to include some type of height or verticality in your level in some way. So, having the player climb up things or having them drop down, adding in the height, adding in that verticality gives a lot more life to the level rather than just always walking on the ground floor. So that doesn't mean you need to build a level that has multiple floors, but even if you have like a warehouse, having certain areas where the player can walk up onto a catwalk and then drop down in certain areas, it can really start to give you a lot more opportunities in your design if you think about having the player climb up and having them drop down. So an example of a one-way / two-way transition using height is, say the player is up on a balcony, right? And now I'm thinking more scraps related. So they're up on a balcony, and once they jump off the balcony into a courtyard, they can't actually go back up, right? So that's an example of a one-way transition. So to make that into a two-way transition, you could have a crate on top of that balcony, that once you push the crate off of the edge, it lands in the courtyard, and you're able to jump on the crate to jump back up to the balcony, right? Depending on how you want the setup to work, that could be a way you can transition between your major areas, right? So your first bubble would be up on the balcony, the next bubble would be down in the courtyard, and you'd have an arrow transitioning between them. So when you're thinking about your transitions, think about having some type of interaction attached to them, right? Avoid the player just walking into the next bubble just because they can. Force them to crouch, force them to jump, force them to stack items together, just anything. Force them to interact in some way, shape, or form rather than just proceeding to the next area. And try to get creative with this. Brainstorm a bunch of ways they can get into your areas. If you're having rooms or spaces the player gets into, there's a lot more ways to get into them other than just using a door, right? You could drop in from the ceiling, come up from underground, blow a hole in the side of the building, right? Break a window. A lot of different things you can do than just open and close a door. So yes, that is acceptable. You could have a locked door that you need to interact with and unlock and get inside of. As long as there's an interaction, that's what we want to focus on. All right, so now in doing that, these are great opportunities for using minor setups in your level. All right, so minor setups are just using those core mechanics in some way, shape, or form, right? So you can see in here some examples, and if you played through the Scraps training grounds that was inside the LDD, you might remember some of these. So like here is an example of you slide out grab the broken piece of the catwalk using the grab null, and then once the catwalk is extended, you can jump to the other side. All right, so just using those core mechanics of the grab null and jump, we've created a small little piece of gameplay. So think about these, what we like to call minor setups, and think about using those as interactions between your major areas. So here's another example. There's a toxic spill, right? And you pick up pallets with the grab null, place them in the toxic waste, and then jump across. Just using the grab null and jumping, you're able to make some gameplay. All right, so here's an example of the transition in the actual bubble diagram. So here we've got the two major bubbles and just an arrow going between the next those two bubbles into the next space. So you can use the arrow with two heads to show two-way and just one head to show the one-way transition and the direction it goes. So definitely I encourage everyone to put a note number on the transition. I know in the example that's not everywhere, but try to make sure there's some interaction on your transition as well. So here's the note of the transition. Basically in the generator room, there's a window. You can pick up an object, throw it, smash the glass, and then jump through the broken window to land down on the factory floor. So this generator room is overlooking the factory floor, so that's why it's a one-way transition, because they're on two different levels. Once you jump through the window, you're down here in the factory floor, and you can't just climb back up. All right, so literal lock and keys, I'm going to actually skip out. I'm not going to do the full spiel on this one. If you go to the bubble diagram assignment and in the playlist, I do cover it in detail. So yeah, literal lock and key. Check out this video and I'll explain exactly why. I want to spend more time on the example and just going over it. Just really remember, we want to stay away from picking up physical keys. We don't want to actually find the blue key and open the blue door. Think about metaphorical alternatives, right? Like you pick up the dynamite and blow up the wall. This zombie head, or this head, was from a level where a student had, it was a scientist lab, and the scientist had um, done some gravinal research, and the player was sent by the Bastions to pick it up, but it was all locked down. So the player had to find the scientist's dead body and rip off the head and use it. It basically used the head to interact with an eye scanner and open up the scientist's lab. So memorable things like that you can create interesting experiences rather than just finding a key. Right? They're all going to technically work the same, but instead of actually collecting that item, try to come up with an interesting thing that you're actually collecting, something immersive to your level. All right, so a few things in the example bubble diagram here that you want to check out is first thing when you guys take a look at this, first thing I want everyone to do is just read through the notes, right? Start at note number 1 and just read through everything. Before you even look at the bubble diagram, just read through these notes and you can visualize and see basically through the player's perspective what the level will be like and what the interaction is going to consist of every step of the way. So once you read through the notes, then you can look at the bubble diagram and start to visualize where those things are happening in each space, right? So the written notes really help you understand what the level is actually consisting of and how the interactions progress from one to the next. And then the bubble diagram itself, the layout, just helps you communicate and visualize where those spaces are going to be. All right, so when you're first building your bubble diagram, don't worry about making the bubbles different sizes. But eventually, once you have them connected and you're starting to see the flow, now you want to start to pay attention to the size of your spaces. All right, this player start icon, this is exactly the exact same size of our player character in Unity. So when we bring your bubble diagram into Unity and actually run around on this, we can basically make sure our player is the size of this icon. If you go ahead and try to, if you visualize and put this player start icon on top of the car, right where the driver's seat will be, you'll see it's proportionate. So that way, when you drop in a vehicle object, an actual asset, it's going to be the size of this icon that we've provided to you. So keep that in mind. Notice how like the hallway is much smaller in size compared to like the factory floor, the main warehouse area. So right, we wouldn't want our hallway to be massive if the player's just walking through a small space. So once you got your bubbles made and you have a good idea of what happens in each bubble, then you can start to add in the details and then add in resizing them and making sure they're actually proportionate to the size you want to be. And there is some trial and error that comes with this. Inside the bubble diagram assignment, we have at the tips. The very last tip is that once you have it built or you're happy with the actual layout of your bubble diagram, this will allow you to test your actual bubble diagram. So saving it out as an image, bringing it into Unity, and you can actually project your bubble diagram onto an object, right, and resize it. And this is what I was talking about, that player start icon. So in our project, we have a tool for you guys to use called the player size. You can pretty much drop this in, and you're going to resize your bubble diagram until the size of that icon matches the size of this object. Right? So that way you know it's proportionate to the player, right? And now you can actually test your level, right? You can quote unquote play your level without having to actually build anything. So I really encourage everybody to do this. When I was saying in the beginning about making a few different variations, make a few different layouts of your bubbles, right? A few different flows, and then bring them in and start to test them out. See which one you're really happy with, and then from there, you can start to add in the notes and the icons and make sure everything's positioned correctly. So as an example of that is, say you want to have a level that has 3 stories. And now you're thinking, okay, well the level starts by the player walks into the building, they go from the first floor up to the 3rd floor, and then they work their way back down to the 1st floor and leave. All right, and you just kind of, that's your flow. But maybe if you have come up with a few different variations, does the level play any differently if, say, the player is flown in by a helicopter and is dropped off on the roof and they work their way down? Or does the level play any differently if they're on the outside and climb up to the 2nd floor then go up to the third floor, and then drop back down to the first, right? So just by repositioning your bubbles and thinking about the flow might lead you to some different ideas. So this process, feel free to do it at any time. I also have a link here just to stopwatch.org, or just a spot where you can have basically a stopwatch, or just use your phone to get a good estimate of your level, right? Actually pretend like you're playing the level. Try to pick up items, jump over obstacles, basically simulate what the level will be like, and make sure you can get through each area within roughly 4 minutes, right? If you're going way over that time, either your bubbles might be way too big or you just have too much gameplay planned in that space. So really, really take the time to do this test. It's really helpful, and you can do this at any point. You can test it when you build your bubble diagram. You can test it when you're starting to build your map. At any point, it's just a lot of trial and error, right? Bring it into Unity, notice something you want to change, go back into Google Draw and fix it, and just kind of rinse and repeat until you're happy with it. That way you know you have a solid plan before you actually start putting in all the time to build this in 3D. It's much easier to change these things while we're on paper or in 2D versus trying to change them in 3D. All right, so up at the top of let me get my pointer back. Up at the top of the bubble diagram, you guys will see a small section for everything that you covered in the LDD, right? So this should be able to be copied and pasted or brought with you from the level design document, explaining your goal, your featured asset, and your 2 mechanics. All right, you should have 6 of the icons placed throughout the bubble diagram, right? So where you're introducing, where you're practicing, and where you're mastering those mechanics, right? I see a lot of students do like to take this approach where they say, introduce tripwires, see note 2, and then there's that same icon for introduce next to note 2, as well as next to note number 2, there's that same icon, communicating where that's actually happening. A few other things that Anthony's doing here to showcase different things about the bubbles is you see here the factory floor has that dotted line around the outside, right? So those are damage volumes where the sandstorm is impacting the player's experience, right? So they can't actually go through there until they shut off the valves, or they're going to take damage for a short period of time. So using the formatting of the bubbles. He also is using color to convey height. Right, so you see the stairs here are a slightly different color blue, and the generator room slightly darker blue to signify those are changes in height. Right, so these don't have to be directly underneath each other, so the stairs aren't directly underneath the generator room, but they're off to the side. The player will come up to the stairs and then come up to the generator room and then jump back down to the factory floor. All right, so one other common issue I see or common mistake that happens with the bubble diagram is backtracking through the level, right? So remember, we don't want the player just to backtrack and walk through empty spaces. We have something we're going to talk about in the map as well called the 10-second rule. There should be something for the player to experience every 10 seconds, even if it's something to jump over, something to crouch under. We don't want to walk for big, long stretches without anything to do, right? So that being said, we also want the player to always be progressing and seeing new interactions. So if we follow the bubble diagram, we come through, we interact with the first valve, we turn off the sandstorm, now we progress to factory floor 2, and here you can see the time estimates have 2 times, right? First visit and second visit. So if you're having the player come back to a bubble for any reason, if they're coming back traveling through this space, there should be an additional note number as well as a time estimate for that second trip. So basically the first time they come to this room, they see the crane, right? There's the icon for the featured asset. So we don't have a visual of what the crane looks like yet. That doesn't matter. But we know the crane is in this space and they see that it's broken. So they need to basically adventure off in the level and power the crane back on so the crane can pick up a pipe that's blocking this hallway so they can accomplish their goal, right? So that's the first trip is what I just described, right? Is they see that's the problem, and now they come through the level, right? Progress through here, come around to get to the generator room, power on the generator with the fuse, which will enable the crane. right? But rather than just having the player turn around and walk back through all of these spaces, right, we can just position the generator room in a space where they're allowed to basically break that window and transition back to the factory floor without having to just turn around and backtrack, right? So try to avoid just having the player walk through big spaces or walk through spaces they've already been unless there's something different about it. So if you want to design a level that has you walk all the way into a building, you interact with something, and I need to make your way back out, you can definitely do that, but there should be a big state change. So you can, you interact with something, and it, sets the whole building on fire. So now you need to make your way out of the building while avoiding the fire, or basically other hazards, like you power on the electricity and it turns on all the turrets. So now you need to go through the same way you came in, but now avoiding the turrets. Tyler, I just saw that you had your hand up. You had your hand raised. Is there something you wanted to ask or anything you want to add in? All right, I'll keep my eye out in case you do. And if anyone else has any questions or anything at any point, feel free to stop me and either raise your hand or post it in chat, and I will address any questions. So back to what I was saying about the factory floor, right? So when they come back to this area, now the crane is powered on. So you'll see there it says note 6 and note 18. So note 6 is describing basically how the player sees it's broken. Note 18 is once they're back at the crane, the player can interact with the control panel, and then the crane will animate, pick up the large debris, and move it out of the way, and the player can progress, right? So there's two different things we're doing when we're returning to that same bubble. That's oftentimes one thing I see as an issue or as a mistake that you want to avoid. So if you're having a bubble they return to, make sure you're explaining what they're doing and why they're coming back to this space. If they're just going through the space to get to the next bubble, really think about your layout and think about the positioning to see if there's another way to actually present that information. All right, so this is a synopsis of what you'll see from the Architect's Guide to Level Design, and just kind of reviewing the approach you want to take when you're building your bubble diagram. So first, you just want to lay out the bubbles, right? Lay out the general space, and if you want to do some sketches on paper or in draw.io or whatever you feel comfortable to get a plan for your level, feel free to use that medium. Then you can start adjusting the size of them, right? Make some bigger, some smaller, right? Larger areas, you want a larger circle. Smaller areas, like tighter spaces, should have a smaller circle. And also keep in mind the size of your bubbles. If you have a big bubble, that means there should be an equal amount, a proportionate amount of gameplay. Right? If it's a massive bubble and all the player does is jump on a box to get to a ledge, you might be able to do that same interaction in a smaller space, right? So you're not having so much empty space to fill in. And then finally, this is going to come in the upcoming weeks, is you're going to use your bubble diagram to now start to convert that into a map. You can almost start to see how he's got these sketches around here, right, and starting to sketch in what the level is going to look like. Then we really start to finalize that in the map, right? So here's basically, you can see, here's the bubble, here's the transition, here's the next bubble, here's the transition and bubble, and you can start to see it flows together. I really like this comment that he says in the article, is that anyone should be able to look at the diagram and see what you're trying to do with the level, but most importantly, so should you, right? That's a real big takeaway, is you're building this bubble diagram to help yourself build the map. So anything that you see helpful to do, anything that helps you communicate what it is you're trying to convey, feel free to take your own approach or add your own style. Before I go to the next slide, I do just want to talk about the adding in height to a bubble diagram, because that can be another challenging thing to think about, right? So I recommend this approach down here to where you can have each bubble laid out. And this would be an example where if you have two floors of a warehouse that like overlap. So the second floor of the warehouse actually exists above this one, directly above it. But what we can do here is we can lay out our bubbles where this is, where the player enters. They transition to the first floor of the lobby, then they transition into the warehouse. So this bubble would explain everything that happens in the first floor of the warehouse itself. And then we can describe what the vertical transition is. So they climb up a catwalk, they ride an elevator, they get on a platform, right? They get inside of a cannon and launch themselves, whatever you can think of, right? But notice how this arrow is visually different than these others. This is just representing the vertical transition, when in reality, the level is going to look like this, to where the warehouse floor 1 and 2 are going to be directly on top of each other, and then we can continue on into the second floor, right? Because now we're on the second floor and transitioning to another bubble. All right, so there's two different ways to portray this. I recommend this one down here below, because then what we can do is when we build our map, you can build this warehouse floor into whatever shape or style you want, and then also convert the second floor. And then when you go to Unity, you'll build right on top of this, and then just move and snap them together, right? And build the second floor on top of the first. So this is what it's going to look like in physical space, but we can break it out and show each floor separately down below in the bubble diagram. So I do challenge everybody to have some type of vertical element in their bubble diagram. It's definitely a good skill to practice, as well as can help you start to visualize your level, and will make the level a bit more interesting. So just again to kind of show you, this is kind of Anthony Louder, the lab instructor's version of the Tulsa Zoo. Kind of I'm showing the progress. So on the left you see that same bubble diagram, and now you can see the map starting to be created. So in the middle image we can start to see the actual structure. And that's going to be the first thing you guys are going to focus on once the bubble diagram is built, is just figuring out the layout of each room. So rather than trying to build the map, this whole thing you see here, right? Because if you're just trying to build this whole map, that's a lot to just construct, right? And design all in your head. But by building the bubble diagram, now we can be like, okay, factory entry, what does that look like? All right, so now we can just, okay, there's the factory entry. That's that structure. All right, hallway. What does the hallway look like? Well, there it is. There's that hallway. All right, puzzle room. What's the puzzle room look like? There it is. And now we can start to connect them all together. David has a question. The 4-minute playtime is for the entire level, right? Yeah, that is correct. The entire playtime. You don't have to factor in things like cutscenes. So like, you want to stay away from having like I'm going to have a 2 minutes of gameplay and a minute of cutscenes to try to get to 3 minutes. Think about 4 minutes of actual gameplay. So if you have like a cinematic of like your car approaching or like helicopter flying away, those extra things don't quite count, but from when the gameplay starts to when it ends, you want to be within that 4-minute mark. And really that's just to keep you guys in scope for the amount of time we have to build this project. So yeah, the main focus you want to do once you have the bubbles is now convert these into architectural spaces, right? And then you can see going from this middle image to the image on the right, this was just adding in more polish, which is things we're going to talk about. Adding in like the player path, adding in the terrain, adding in the more surrounding pieces of the environment. But that's not going to matter until we have the gameplay areas defined and we have the interactions planned for each level. All right, so that's the overall purpose of the bubble diagram. I just wanted to take some time and reiterate the things that are in the playlist. I know I skipped over like the literal lock and key. I just briefly talked about it, but I definitely see there's a disconnect and not really understanding like why you're building the bubble diagram or the purpose of it. And it's really just to help you plan out your spaces, so then you don't have to just build this, what you're seeing. You have like a skeleton, and you just go piece by piece and making adjustments and changing the design as you go forward. So does anybody have any questions about the bubble diagram? Yeah, they definitely do. So the level design documents, that's like your almost like your proposal. So you pitch, you're gonna, you're all tasked with designing levels. You can come up with a whole bunch of ideas, or a whole bunch of level designers will all be in a room together, and then they will pitch those areas and pitch their ideas for the level. And then most of the time, the lead designer will then like decide which ones will work, which things they want to adjust, and then is really from there to start to build their own. It's a personal choice. It's uh, some will have their own process that they follow. Others will definitely have a structure they want everyone to be using. But yeah, as a level designer, it's a really, really helpful thing to do to figure out, the flow of the level before you're designing all of the details. But yeah, even, going through this process and building maps is definitely things that level designers do in the industry to create the games that you guys enjoy. And that's the thing, like each company might have their own version of an LDD. Like some companies might have a bulleted list. All right, I give you guys like a template and structure to follow. But then once you're out in the industry or you're designing your own game, you can make your own template, right, or design your own structure of things that should be required and should be included in each level. All right, great question though, Michael. If anyone has any other questions about the bubble diagram about the design process, I'd be more than happy to answer them. So the one thing I'm going to cover just about the control station, and then if anyone wants to, like, if anyone has any questions about, like, are my mechanics worthy? Is there something I should adjust before I go forward? If you guys want to pitch any of your mechanics, I'd be more than happy to use the last time that we have to do so. The one thing I want to mention about the control station is really the goal of this activity is to get practice analyzing reference images. And ProBuilder. That's the main thing. So if you guys already have experience with ProBuilder, or if you feel comfortable and you want to build your own version of the control station, feel free to find your own reference. So the reference I used was from a game called Please Don't Touch Anything. Um, there was a game before. This is the VR version. There was one before that was, I think, just Don't Touch Anything, I think was the first one. And this is the second version of it. So using this image here and this image down below in construction, we're going to pretty much use that as a starting point. So let me jump over here. So you'll see when we're building the control station, the overall structure of the object, the overall frame here, even this filing cabinet, I end up using in a different place, right? It's all about using these as a starting point. It doesn't mean you have to match yours exactly to look like this, but you should be able to see resemblances and see things pulled from your reference. So here, like I mentioned, if you have your own reference that you'd like to use, or you find something, I was just working with a student today who was building a fighter cockpit, really cool style, kind of similar to the image down here. But if you want to find your own reference images to build your control station of any kind, feel free to do so. Right? You don't have to do that. You can go through and follow the activity, and it will lead you to build this. So this will also showcase and give you a lot of insight to the different tools and the different actions you can use with ProBuilder. There is a lot to actually build. There is a lot of actions to cover with ProBuilder, and the control station is just kind of getting you're getting your feet wet with those tools, as well as getting you comfortable snapping objects together, snapping objects on the grid, and vertex snapping one object to another. Yeah, here's an example of snapping one vertice to another specific vertice in the scene. So that's the main takeaway from this activity, is just getting you guys comfortable and making sure everybody's comfortable moving objects in 3D space. So here is the image of what it will guide you through. So then afterwards, if you want to follow through the activity and then customize it, you can do so, right? So here is just my version of taking basically this and then starting to add my own pieces. So I added a little drawer. Here's that filing cabinet I mentioned. So, taking one element and putting it somewhere else. Here are those little paddle switches. I added in a glass case so we could make this locked. I have a little TV monitor, a lever, and you can see a lot of those pieces were actually pulled from my reference, right? So here's that paddle switch. I just repositioned where it was, right? The big red button we made, that was the button right in the center. There's that little drawer I used as inspiration. There's the filing cabinet door. There's even that little lever is what I kind of used as a starting point. So if you find your own reference and you want to build it, right, the main takeaway is having the representative shape and silhouette, right? That's what you want to go for, is the shape is recognizable, you know what it is, and the overall silhouette of the object resembles the image. So you can see you don't have to go nuts and add in all these tiny little buttons and switches and everything in there, but we're using like all these tiny little lights down below, right? You don't have to add all those details as long as it's representative of the image, right? The image is just a starting point for you to get going with. And this is just practice for what you'll do in level design, where you start to find environmental images and you start to dissect those pieces, create modular pieces, and then recreate them in the environment. So I'm going to just go through, last thing I'm going to go through is just the grade breakdown. So after each experiment, right, and for the control station, there's two main experiments. Make sure that you are checking out the scene before you start working, and you submit the scene after each experiment, right? So for the very first activity, you'll see it has right in the beginning of the instructions for a scene setup to check out your experiment scene in the meta file. Then when you get finished, at the very bottom, it will tell you to submit. Right, so now you'll have two versions of your scene. One you added for project setup, second is you added for the control station. Then for the second experiment, this is all about texturing and adding materials. Let me just pull it over here. So this will walk you through, I've provided you guys textures. If you'd like to find your own textures, I have the website here I recommend, textures.com. It's really, really awesome, and it's royalty free. How it works is you get 15 credits a day, so you just need an email address and a username, and you get 15 credits. So now I can go over to the main page, and like say I want to come down, I want to find, concrete, and then there's a bunch of subcategories. So I can go to dirty, and then I can actually choose different textures, right? So you'll see ones that are seamless. You hover over them and